This is our Rats at ICC. I'm analyzing a game from Team 4545 League between Chatica and Jorobo. This game was submitted for a candidate as Game of the Week for Week 3. Let's have a look and see what happens. Okay, the game starts out even. White plays a quiet line, bishop f4. Black should have no trouble equalizing with this. The advantage of a move like this is it takes Black pretty much out of his book and his preparations, so the players are kind of winging it. The game just continues with a little bit of development, normal moves, and Black goes ahead and plays an active move and threatens to capture the pawn on b2. This is often a good strategy to employ from either side of the board, white or black, when the queen's bishop comes out and leaves the b2 pawn unprotected. There's two ways to deal with this. My own personal preference is to usually push the pawn to b3. That can lead to some trouble because of the weakness on the a5 e1 diagonal, but this is something in this kind of position Black can't really exploit. A lot of times in a French defense, the bishop gets to b4 with check, and White has a nuisance to deal with and might have to park his king on f1 just to get away from the check. But this kind of position, b3 I think is preferable to queen c1, although there's usually nothing wrong with queen c1, which is what White played. The drawback as I see it with queen c1 is eventually that queen's going to have to move again, and the threat on the pawn on b2 may still exist if the queen wanted to come into play later somewhere along the diagonal c1 to h6, or maybe even hop over to e1 and come down the e file. That pawn on b2 would be unprotected, and White might not be able to sacrifice it. Okay, so let's continue with how the game went. Black just makes an exchange, opening up the position a little bit. Black now has a half-open c file. White has a half-open e file, and Black goes ahead and makes a threat, develops a piece, attacks on d4. White deals with that, and Black just continues developing, and so does White. And at this point, White makes a severe strategic error, in my opinion. If you were to show this to 100 chess players of varying strengths, probably almost everyone is going to select knight bd2. It's a natural, continuing, developing move, and let Black show what he plans. Probably he's going to play bishop e7, as it's the only free square for the bishop to go to, and then castle. And then White can continue on with his moves. He might, the game might continue knight bd2, bishop e7, rook e1, castles, and then White plays knight f1. Now that knight on f1 is either going to play to g3 or e3 and attack the bishop on f5. And although the game is even, this is something that probably most players would consider, and it preserves ever so slightly the advantage of the first White move. Okay, but like I said, White makes a severe mistake here. Now, it's not one to cost him the game, but it has a lot of ramifications that you need to know about. Okay, what he does is he just simply brings the bishop back to e3. This makes no sense, and I'll tell you why. Okay, first place, you're moving a piece twice in the opening. Bad idea. You got to get your pieces into play, as I just showed. Next thing is, White just handed Black this diagonal, h2 to b8. White had it under his control, and now Black has it for his own. He can, instead of having to park that bishop on e7, it can go to d6, and then Black has a wonderful bishop, and White's bishop is just sitting there bad. Now, it could be, as backed up by the next White move, that White is putting into play a concept of overprotection. This is something better explained by Aaron Nimzovich in his book My System, and the discussion of that is beyond the realm of this discussion. So look it up on your own time if you're not familiar with it. But by overprotection he's overprotecting the pawn on d4. But there's other reasons why you don't want to play a move like bishop e3. Okay, in the first place, when you're the higher rated player, that's going to happen sometimes when you play your opponent. Sometimes you're going to be better than he, sometimes he's going to be better than you. But you can't always say that your rating is going to win you the game, because your rating doesn't win the game. Your moves win the game. Statistically speaking, a 200-point ELO rating difference, I think, means White wins 75% of the time. However, if you're that's based on from the game at the start. If you keep making poor choices, you're bringing that percentage down because you're not playing the moves that would have given your opponent fits. You're playing moves that give your opponent a good position. And the better you make your opponent's position, the more interested he's going to become in the game, and the more able he's going to be able to find good moves. So you don't want to just hand your opponent everything he wants right out of the opening. And if you're playing weak moves like this, chances are you're just not in a good playing mood today, and you're going to continue to make weak moves, and you're going to soon find yourself losing the position. So if White's not happy with the way he feels, probably what he should do instead of playing bishop e3 is just try a couple more moves that I showed, knight bd2, and then offer a draw and say, look, I don't feel like playing today. I'm happy with a draw. Would you like one? And it's up to Black if he wants to take it or not, of course. And if White's playing weak moves, he's probably not going to take it, and he shouldn't. So like I say, there's reasons why you don't want to play weak moves against an opponent and expect your rating to come in and win the game for you, because it'll bite you. It'll bite you more often than you might expect. Okay, let's continue and see what happens. Black goes ahead and seizes that diagonal, and here's White playing the rook to d1, overprotecting the pawn on d4. And again, maybe that rook would have been better placed on e1 and bring the rook on a1 over to d1 eventually when White gets his queen side developed. Or possibly later in the game, double up the rooks on the e-file. Of course, you can't do that with the bishops in the way, but eventually you could. Okay. Now, White says, well, I really don't have an idea what I'm doing here, so I'll just go attack something. I'll go back. Now, in fact, White's just said, here, have a move, Black, have a free move. So this choice wasn't very wise. Meanwhile, look at his queen side. It's still sitting there undeveloped. Now, White finally says, well, I'm going to get my queen knight out finally. Hopefully get my pieces developed on the queen side. And Black finds a good square for his bishop. He's got his queen rook out of play, and it's now tucked back on b8, maintaining the pressure on h2. And White finally says, well, I better get my queen developed so I can get my rook developed. And then Black says, well, you know what? I want that bishop on e3. I want to make a weakness of the on e3, and I want to have the two bishops versus the knight. And at the same time, I'll keep up a little pressure on h2. If you don't do anything, I'm going to play queen c7 and go down there and snatch that pawn. So White says, okay, I don't have any square to put my bishop on e3 now, but I don't want to take on f3 with a pawn, so I'll put my knight on f1, and if you take it, I'll recapture with the knight. Sure enough, that's what happens. So we have a quick exchange of pieces, and Black says, you know what? I got a plan here. I'm going to get rid of the protection of h2. I'll give back the bishop pair. I don't need them. And now I'm going to start sending my pawns forward. So Black already has the activity here and any initiative that exists from it. Well, White still has not completed his development. And White's going to be in a bad way here if he's not careful. Let's take a look what happens next. So White says, okay, yeah, I see you want to attack me on the king side, so I'll tell you what, let's trade queens. Well, Black wants no part of that because he's got the better position, and he just comes down here and makes a threat. Queen c7 attacks the pawn on h2, and White's got to deal with that. White might want to consider g3 here, but it's going to soon lead to some exchanges. The pawn can go to f4, and if the knight goes back to f1, g3 is now exposed after f takes g3, so White really has no choice here, but he has to play knight to f1. Now, after 20 moves, let's look at what's happened. Material is dead even, but every black piece is superior to its white counterpart here. The black queen and bishop have a battery attack on h2. They're active and they're aggressive. The white queen and bishop are not working together in any harmony. They don't really have any scope. White has some indirect threat on b7, but that's not something black needs to worry about right now. It might be moves before that queen moves to better square to continue the attack, and White might not even be able to take that pawn safely. Indirectly, maybe White has some pressure on d5 You can give up a bishop for 2 pawns with a check, but there's really not much else white has after that, and eventually would be ground down and lose the game. So the white knight is weaker than the black knight. White knight is tied down. It's tied down guarding h2. It has one square it can go to, g3. Then where does it go? Back to f1, right? So it's not doing white any good. Meanwhile, the black knight is ready to play to a5, hop into c4, a5 with tempo, then hop into c4, possibly some threats on b2. And if it's ever kicked away, it'll just drop back to d6, and it's all ready to hop into e4. A nice square for that knight. The black rooks are better. The queen rook is on the half-open file. The white queen rook is still undeveloped. The black king rook is on kind of a half-open file. It's ready to hop into f6 and maybe over to h6 and to f6 and maybe over to g6 and h6. And there's that white rook still stuck on d1 overprotecting. So let's see what happens. Knight goes into a5, and black starts getting all kinds of time. All the pieces, every time you look, another black piece is coming into play. As white decides he doesn't want that knight on e4, so he's going to weaken himself a little further by putting the pawn on f3. Black just starts gaining all kinds of space on the king side. And finally, at move 29, white finally gets some activity going. But black just deals with that fine with a pin, makes some exchanges, and makes white waste the time to get his piece to get his pawn back. Now he attacks the pawn with a threat. And at this point, white tries something desperate here. It'd been better to play g3 or king h1. Okay, king h1 gets it off that dangerous diagonal. g3, maybe you want to play pawn to f4. And as a result, you usually don't want to put your pawns on the same color as the opposing bishop. But maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea in this position because it blunts a lot of that activity in the middle game. And then white can try to hold on into the ending. Would have to watch out for positions if the white pawns get up to g3 and f4, and say that black pawn on h5 goes. You might have to watch out for later sacrifices on f4, followed by a push of g3 and queening the pawn, or in some positions where the bishop comes down to g1 and captures the pawn from behind. And even though in some positions white can win that bishop, it's going to get a couple pawns for it, leaving black with a couple dangerous pawns. And if the black king is active in the center of the board, the white game can be lost very quickly. So white has a little tactic with this to get his piece back, but it just leaves him with a bad game. Okay, some quick exchanges. And here white commits the fatal error. He needed to play rook a8 and try to get into some position where he can draw. Even if you drop the pawns on f3 and d4, you have a chance to hold the draw. Black will still have a pass pawn on e6, and the h-pawns aren't necessarily too dangerous here. That was white's best shot to try to prove a draw, but he's still defending it. But he just falls into a lost position very quickly, where white's pieces just shuffle back and forth, and black just improves his position, and finally reaches a position where a rook and 2 pawns wins. Some of these positions actually draw, but this isn't one of them. The pawn is just too active, and it's going to queen. There's nothing white can do to stop the pawn from going to a2, the rook from moving away with check and queening the pawn. All right, a wonderful game from Jorobo. Congratulations, you played very, very well, and I thank everybody for their time and looking at this game. I hope you all learned something from it. Take care.